You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our dinner and dialogue gathering on July 23rd, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. Well, good evening, friends. Tonight, I want to return to a question that's been echoing in me since our gathering last week. A question that's become more urgent than ever in light of our political climate, our fractured relationships, and the increasingly militarized streets of our own neighborhoods. How do we recover our neighborliness in a time like this? Last week, we asked what it means to offer a moral response in the face of systemic injustice, particularly the heartbreaking and violent ICE raid that happened right here in our own county. We named love as the higher law. We remembered that hospitality is not charity, but sacred solidarity with those who are being harmed. And tonight, I want to invite us to carry that same moral vision into a new dimension, namely our relationships with one another, our society, our culture of division, harm, and outrage. Because it's not only our policies that need healing, it's us, I don't mean neighbor in the technical sense, those who live next door to us. I mean it in the deeper sense, or perhaps the more sacred sense, the kind that Jesus spoke of in the parable that we referenced briefly last week, the Good Samaritan. After telling that story, Jesus doesn't answer the question, who is my neighbor? He reframes it altogether into, which one was a neighbor? And that's always the question for each of us, isn't it? What does it look like to be a neighbor in 2025? Because friends, here's the rub. We live in an isolating time. And not just because of screens or major media outlets or social media, although all of those affect us. It's not just because of pandemics or economic pressures that are lingering, but because of something deeper, a long, quiet unraveling of our social fabric. I know we've talked about this book before, but a couple decades ago, sociologist Robert Putnam warned us in his book, Bowling Alone, that Americans were withdrawing from one another, not just from churches and civic groups, but from bridge clubs, PTA meetings, neighborhood associations, and even pickup bowling leagues. It wasn't just a metaphor. He said we were still bowling, just not in leagues anymore. What we've lost, Putnam wrote, is what he called social capital, the web of trust and reciprocity and civic life that binds communities together, which I would say is the mark of a healthy society. It's those shared rituals of everyday connection that build belonging. And so here we are, lonelier than ever, and we're not just personally, but collectively estranged. We've become more individualistic, more fragmented, and more suspicious of one another. The erosion of civic life has hollowed out the spaces where our empathy might grow. And if you're anything like me, maybe you've probably felt this hollowing of trust in your own life. In family relationships strained by difference, in old friendships that have grown quiet, or even in church communities where you once felt at home. I've felt it in that subtle tightness in my chest when I learn a next-door neighbor just down the street holds opposing political views that clash with mine. Do you know what I mean? Have you ever wondered where all of this has come from? Well, a recent book by author Kurt Gray called Outraged paints a picture to help us understand the dynamics of our moral confusion and the urgency of recovering our neighborliness. In it, Gray reminds us that we didn't evolve as dominant predators. We evolved as vulnerable creatures in dangerous environments. To begin with, we were not the hunters, but the hunted. Our ancestors had to be on high alert to threats, and that vigilance, especially toward mistreatment of those within our in-groups, became part of our moral DNA. So when we feel outrage, when we are stirred by stories of harm, it's not a flaw in us, it's actually a signal that something we love is under threat. But get this, and I think this is fascinating. The problem in our time, Gray says, is that our ancient radar for harm is now firing in a modern world. A world flooded with information, a world where even words, silence, disagreement, and sometimes symbols can be perceived as moral injury instead of actual interpersonal harm. And he calls this concept creep, which he defines as a gradual widening of what we consider harmful. Sometimes that widening can be good, right? It helps us become more sensitive to injustice, but other times it can blur the line between discomfort and actual harm. And it's that blurring that leaves everyone feeling under siege. Have you ever known someone who just walks around with that feeling like everyone is out to get them? It puts you on edge too, doesn't it? To me, it takes about 30 seconds of scrolling through Instagram to see a video pop up of someone calling out someone else for harm. I wish we could do a little contest real quick to see, but I'd put money on if you open the app, within 30 seconds, you're going to see somebody calling out harm. Left and right, activist and traditionalist, every side now sees itself as the victim. And that's what Gray calls competitive victimhood. Doesn't that phrase ring true? Each side is shouting, "We're the ones who have been wronged." And no one is listening long enough to say, "I see your pain and I honor your story." And so here we are, isolated not just physically, but morally, trapped in our bubbles, in our echo chambers, building walls not just around our homes, but around our hearts. But here's the good news. We don't have to stay there. Gray offers a simple framework, and he calls it CIV: connect, invite, and validate. He says we connect by being curious instead of combative. We invite others to share, not to debate them, but to tell the story of their hurt or their harm. And we validate their moral experience, not because we agree with it, and that's crucial, but simply because we care. It's a bit like the image of the Good Samaritan, isn't it? He didn't interrogate the man who was hurt. He didn't check into who he voted for or his politics or his background or his citizenship status. He saw pain and he crossed the road. He connected, he invited that man into his own circle of concern and care and validated his humanity. And this, I believe, is the sacred path of neighborliness in an isolating time. Can you feel our desperation for it in this moment? Not louder arguments, not sharper ideologies, but a more tender moral imagination. The kind of imagination that asks, what burden do they carry? What harm do they feel? And what would love look like here? Maybe you have someone in your life who it's hard to be decent with. Someone who doesn't exactly mirror yourself back to you. Someone for whom it's a challenge for you to be around and especially to be with in any significant social situation. We all have those people in our lives, right? I know I do. I'm always learning this myself as well. I have a close family member in my extended family who I've had to walk this path with for a long time. They couldn't be more opposite of me politically. And for years, we've just sort of avoided real conversations. I think mostly fearing the clash, and to be honest, it's just sort of stayed like that. Not for any reason, no bad blood, nothing really happened. I think we just both don't quite know how to reapproach. It's so tough, right? This is just where it hits home for me. The slow dissolution of trust and social capital. It feels like if we were to re-engage, not only would we have almost nothing left in common, but it feels like it could get inflammatory really quick, you know? Now, this is where I think Gray's understanding of harm is so important, because he defines harm as interpersonal wrongness, a sense that someone has been mistreated by another. But he reminds us harm is not always objective, it's often intuitive, based on how we feel, what we've suffered, what we fear. It's difficult because even if there was no physical, objective, person-to-person harm, because of the concept creep, the intuitive sense of harm is real. But here's the trick. When we hear someone else express moral outrage, we don't have to agree with them. Instead, we can ask, what's the wound underneath? What's the threat they're trying to name? What pain are they holding? And it's that question, when asked with compassion, that can become a bridge. That question is the balm. That question is how we can become neighbors again. But let's be honest, it's easy to love the agreeable neighbor, isn't it? But not as easy to love the neighbor who voted differently, the one who posts inflammatory things and just won't listen. Can we become neighbors to them? I wonder with you all if that's the call, if that's the radical hospitality that Jesus modeled again and again. Not just for the wounded, but also for the wounders. Not just for the poor, but for the powerful too. Inviting all of us into healing and transformation. I think often about the story from last week, the ICE raid in Carpinteria, the civilians who stood between agents and the farm workers, the videos of people with open hands being met with force. And my guess is that it would be easy for most of us at Way Collective to see that as a picture of neighborliness, not just feeling compassion, but embodying on the front lines. But the more difficult task for those of us who are left-leaning is to see that whether we agree with it or not, that the opinions of those on the right are moral issues for them as well. And the research actually suggests that it's easier for the right to understand the left's position than it is for the left to understand the right's position. But the difficulty for both sides is being able to validate that the other's moral opinion is in fact experienced as moral by them. So all of this brings us here to the deeper invitation of this evening and this moment. Remember, this is a time where the threads of civic connection are fraying. Ours is a culture shaped by moral confusion and especially by outrage. The norm in our society is to retreat into fear or certainty and separate from one another. But perhaps we are being called to something more ancient and essential, to become neighbors again, to rebuild trust in the smallest, most human ways possible, to practice empathy where it's been hollowed out, to let love, not ideology, define our boundaries. In a world of moral confusion, may we be clear in our love. In a time of outrage, may we become vessels of mercy. In a society that's continually fractured by difference, may we become bridges not by winning arguments, but by understanding the deeper cry within each of us to be seen, known, and loved. Practicing connection, invitation, and validation, Gray's CIV approach, isn't a strategy to convert others over to our side. Rather, it's a sacred work of deepening human interdependence and mending the fractured social connections that are keeping us apart. Okay, I'm looking forward to talking about this with you all. So here are 3 questions for contemplation and conversation. The first question, the self question. Where in your own life have you noticed the pull toward outrage or retreat in the face of difference? And what might it look like to respond instead with curiosity or compassion toward yourself and others? Number 2, the sacred question. What does it mean to you that neighborliness, offering mercy, not judgment, is at the heart of the spiritual path? And how does this reshape your image of upholding the sacredness of all people in our time? And lastly, the third question, the society question. In a time of growing moral division and social isolation, what small acts of connection might help restore trust in your neighborhood, workplace, or community? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.